Good day. My name is Michael Malondo, and I'm going to discuss the subject of psychological counseling for the third year higher diploma. We are going to cover a number of assignments, 8 in total, and we're going to explain in details what is expected from you as a student, and then what you have to do in order to prepare and then submit your assignments. So I will quickly go through the 8 assignments, and then I'm going to discuss it as we go along in details. So the first one is you have to discuss the aspect of the needs of people living with HIV/AIDS. And you are going to look at the social, physical, spiritual, and psychological needs of these patients, and specifically patients that are on palliative care. So during this assignment, you can also discuss what is palliative care and how palliative care is very important for people living, patients that are with HIV/AIDS, and how you can then meet these needs of these people through palliative care. The second assignment is then also looking at the social psychology of HIV/AIDS counseling, and how does social psychology play a role, and why is it very important, especially when it comes to HIV counseling. The third one is you're going to look at the issues of children, and you're also going to look at what are the needs of children. And when you look at the needs of children, you're going to look at the different development stage of children. You are also going to look at how does children perceive certain things, especially when it comes to drawing of pictures. You have to discuss the elements of the children's personality, their emotions, their development, and also their skills and health. The fourth assignment is then looking at grief. What role does grief play? And you can also look at grief counseling, and how it's very important. You can discuss grief counseling and look at the different dimension of grief. Then assignment number 5 is also looking at the psychosocial and emotional implication of HIV on children, but it's looking specifically what children are facing in sub-Saharan Africa, but you can also look, for an example, in Namibia. And there are 6 things that you have to look at when it comes to children. There are 6 examples that we are giving that you can experience in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at those 6 examples, you have to discuss what are the needs, what are the challenges, and what changes or improvement do you recommend when it comes to the psychosocial emotional needs of children in Namibia, of course. Then the 6th assignment, you are going to look at the different standards of ethics, how these standards are applied when it comes to counseling. You have to work, and then you have to give some practical example how you can apply it. Assignment number 7 is talking about the whole issue of counseling, and you are looking specifically at counsel of a couple, and how are you going to bring this whole thing of couple counseling, and in the context of spiritual counseling, especially when the counselor is a minister of the gospel or is a spiritual leader. So you have to bring up these whole issues. And assignment 7 is giving you a case study. So you have to read those case study in the context of the basic principle of counseling. And then you have to, that's number 1. And number 2 is you have to identify is what issues do you pick up in that case study, what ethical issues are there. And if and number 3, then you have to give reasons for your answer. Why do you think that specific issue is an ethical issue? And number 4 is you have to give them solution or your recommendation. Assignment number 8 is looking at persons living with HIV/AIDS, and you're going to look specifically at people that are very terminal ill. And then you are going to bring out the issue of the biblical and religious principle of counseling. You're going to look at Bible counseling, you're going to look at Christian counseling, you're going to look at religion counseling, spiritual counseling. So Assignment 8 is very straightforward. You have to look at, if somebody is terminally and bedridden, how are you going to bring out the religious or spiritual counseling as part of a tool to discuss or to address or to help this person needs. Now, we're first going to look at assignment 1. So assignment 1 is you have to look at what role does palliative care play, and how palliative care can actually meet the need of children, and what are these different needs. So palliative care is looking at children, and what it actually means. So I've given a definition of what palliative care is. So you might look at, so it all look at the relief of people that are suffering, and then to see how you can maximize the quality of life, and not only the life of the patient, but also the life of the family. Then secondly, you're going to look at the whole issue of intervention. How are you going to intervene in this patient? And then of course you have to look at other diseases like communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, and then also look at examples of people that are suffering from cancer and how you can also use it. So that's the whole idea of the first assignment that which you have to bring out, discussing palliative care and what role does palliative care play when it comes to people that are living with HIV/AIDS, and specifically looking at their needs. Now, assignment number 2 is looking at the whole concept of social psychology. What is social psychology? What role does social psychology play? And how can you use social psychology when it comes to HIV counseling? Now, social psychology is mostly looking or is concerned about the behavior of people, other people, and how do this behavior actually affect other people. So it's very important that when you are going to discuss the concept of social psychology in your HIV counseling, it's how are you going to bring out the issue of behavior, talking about the risky behavior, and how can the behavior of the client actually affect people around him. And then you can also bring up some scientific study on people's thoughts, their emotions, their feelings, the behavior, and how that also influence other people when it comes to the society in a whole. So in your assignment number 2, you have to look at this, and you have to give as much as possible practical example. How does social psychology actually play a role when it comes to HIV counseling? So when we look at assignment number 3, is you are going to look at the issue of children. Now, children are having different challenges when it comes to especially those that are orphans and vulnerable children. So in this assignment, you're going to look at the basic the basic concept of the child's personality. How does this personality affect their emotions? And when it comes to the development of a child, whether it's mental, spiritual, or psychological development, you have to discuss this whole development of children. And then also looking at the skills. Children also, as they develop throughout their stage, there are also certain skills that children acquire. And you can discuss these different skills of children and how this is very important. And of course, if you are going to discuss this, then you must also conclude with the health of children. Why is children? Now, the other questions that people are asking is, why can children learn any language while adults have to work so hard to learn a second language? Now, this is something that it's always asked mostly by psychologists. So you can also bring or use that question as an argument where you talk about the development and the personality of children. Now, if you are going to discuss it, then you have to know what psychology is all about. Now, the basic psychology or the concepts of psychology is they're saying they're looking at the behavior, the mental processes of children, and how does this mental processes actually affect the children's physical state, mental state, and what influence does these children have on the external environment. So in this assignment, you have to discuss this as much as possible. Then we've got the 4th assignment, where you have to look at grief. Now, when we talk about grief, we are talking about somebody that actually lost a loved one. And this is a way how you cope with that loss. There was a death in your family, or there was a death in someone that you know, someone that's very close. So the emotion that you are experiencing, the grief that you are experiencing, is the question is, how are you going to deal with that grief? Now, in counseling, there is what they call grief counseling, and this is where you actually bring somebody in and you counsel that person that's experienced those emotions. Now, as those emotions are being developed, and there are certain symptoms which might which might already start before the person actually die, or the loved one die. So how are you going to deal with that person? Now, in grief counseling, while you're dealing with this client, there are certain aspects that you have to look at. You have to look at the mental state, the physical, emotional state, how they react to the sense of loss, and then take the client throughout that whole process, so that the client at the end of the day can accept the reality of the death or the grief, and then deal with the grief. So this counseling is also called bereavement counseling, where you can also use this type of technique or kind of counseling in order for those to help those that are actually coping or wants to cope with the loss of a loved one, which is a very good supporting mechanism. So in your assignment, you have to give some practical example as much as possible, so that you can discuss the whole issue of grief counseling. Now, assignment 5 is looking at the whole issue again of children, and we are looking at the psychosocial, emotional implication of children. Now, the first thing when you start with your assignment, you have to first mention what is psychosocial and emotional needs. What are the needs of children? If we talk about psychosocial needs, what are those needs for children? When we talk about emotional needs, what are those needs? So you have to first discuss in your assignment with, of course, practical example, what is the psychosocial need of children? What is the emotional needs of children? Then secondly, you have to discuss what are the challenges. Now, there are 6 examples that we are giving in this assignment. Specifically in looking at SADC or in Namibia, the first thing that you have to look at is you have to look at the family unit. What is a family unit? How does family unit or a family affect a child? The secondly is we have to look at economy, where the country is very poor. How does the economy of a country have an effect on this child? The third thing is we have to look at the issue of urbanization, going from rural to urban migration. So a child that's coming from a rural area and find him or herself in an urban area, which means in a city or town, what impact does it have? What if the parents are unemployed? How does that affect the child? The fourth one is the issue of culture. We've got so different culture. What if you have a child that grows up in front of a TV and exposed by media and exposed by different things that can actually communicate that these are the needs? And what if the child puts those needs or those demands on the parents based on what the child perceives on the media? So how does that affect the child? And then, of course, politics, wars, epidemic, how does that also affect the child? And then number 6, of course, looking at the morality of a nation and the morality of a family. So does that address the psychosocial and emotional needs of a child? So which is very important. The other thing that you have to look in your assignment also is to look at the psychological care. Now, psychological care looks at the whole issue of counseling per se, and then also at the supportive environment. Does this child have a family, or is this child an orphan? If the child is at school, does the child have friends? Does the child go to school? With who does the child grows up? So all of that does have a psychological impact on the child, and it's very important. The issue of religion, the issue of church, the issue of community, how or what role does it play to the child? And this is what you have to discuss in your assignment. And then also looking then at the environment where the child is. Is that the right environment or is it the wrong environment? And how does that environment address the need of the child when it comes to the psychosocial and emotional need of a child? So assignment number 6 is looking at the issues of ethics. And ethics is very, very much more important, especially when it comes to counseling. And there are certain principles that one has to adhere to. And if one adhere to this principle, then of course one will make sure that you address the need of the client. So for this presentation, I've only mentioned 4 principles, but there is a number of principles that you have to look at. The first one is autonomy, which looks at confirmed consent, that you have the permission from the client to counsel that, and the client made the choice out of his or her free will to be counseled. Then, of course, caring that the client must know that you as a counselor, you care for the client. And this is the ethics of beneficence, which is one of the basic principles of caring. Then we've got non-maleficence, which just look at you don't need or you must not give put any harm on a client, or you must not harm the client, which is then also important. Now, in your assignment, you have to discuss this. And remember, you are explaining all of these things, what is related, and you can look at the basic ethical principle of counseling. What is the need? Then, of course, we've got justice, which talks about transparency. So if you are a counselor, you have to be open towards the client, and you have to explain to the client. So the more transparent you are towards the client, the more transparent will the client be towards you as a counselor. Accountability, of course, the client must know that you are accountable to his or her. Whatever you discuss will be kept confidentiality, and that sense of responsibility of the counselor towards the client is very important. And then, of course, you have to keep that consistency, which is very, very much important. The issue of stigma and discrimination as part of the ethical principle, you have to discuss. Give practical example of stigma. Give practical example of discrimination. Give practical examination of self-stigmatization. And then, of course, you can use the Namibian legal framework. You can also use the Namibian instruments that are actually put in place, which makes it very much more important. So in your assignment, discuss it, give examples, discuss each principle, and with each principle you give practical example. And of course you can also discuss, you gave the definition, you discuss it, then you talk about the importance of this principle to counseling. And then you might also give and discuss the advantage and disadvantage of these principles, and discuss the challenges that you can face as a counselor, and then give your recommendation or solution for each challenge. In the ethical principle is what do you recommend, what is the solution. Then we go to the 7th assignment, which is a case study. As I said earlier, you have to read this case study. And of course, when you look at the couple, Amanda and Daniel, that's coming for counseling to Martin, and Martin is a counselor, he's a minister of the gospel. How is he going to use biblical counseling? Spiritual counseling as much as possible. Now, just to explain, now if you are going to go through and read through this case study, you have to make sure that you are going to highlight what might be the possible ethical issues, or what might be certain things that might break the ethical principle when it comes to counseling. Now, just to give you an example what ethics is. Now, ethics come from the Greek word ethos, which actually means character. And then what it means, it explores the concept of right and wrong. And when we look at the concept of right and wrong, what is right, what is wrong? And then we ask the question is what role does morality play when it comes to the concept of right and wrong? What is moral? What is immoral? What is accepted? What is unacceptable? What is normal? What is abnormal? This is the basic principle of ethics. And in this case study, you have to bring that as much as possible, discuss it in detail, so that. And then you will also discuss now, since this couple is coming for counseling, and they want to get married, for an example. It's also part of a pre-test counseling or a premarital counseling. So what if you're going to talk about HIV/AIDS in this counseling? Does the couple know their status? And if the couple know their status, how are they going to treat them? And if the couple status is positive or whatever, will irrespective of the outcome of their status or their test, will they still get married? So these are all of the issues that you have to discuss when you are going to deal with this assignment. So it's a very sensitive assignment, which is a real life story, what happened in Namibia. So, and give practical example. So if you are the counselor, what are you going to do? And should you violate any ethical principle, what are those ethical principles? And if you violate, what will you do to overcome or to avoid those violations? And so this is what you have to discuss in this assignment. And of course, as I said earlier, you have to give practical example and solutions. Now the final and the last assignment is looking also at biblical counseling, but it looks at what when it comes to religion and counseling, is what role does religion or spirituality play when it comes to counseling. So it's very important that in your discussion or in your assignment, you have to define what religion is. You have to define what spirituality is, and how do you link religion and spirituality to counseling. So when you bring that out, it makes it very much more easy when you are going to discuss the concept. What about people living with HIV/AIDS? How are you going to accommodate them in this kind of counseling? How are you going to help them? How are you going to assist them? How are you going to guide them? And of course, which is very important, is when you are going to look at spiritual counseling, you have to focus on the person. Now, what meaning does spirituality have for a person? What meaning does religion have to a person? How do they, for an example, see it? How do they view it? So these are some of the dynamics which you have to bring out in your assignment. And then you have to look at the role it plays. Does it play a role in counseling, for an example? And if you are going to use this type of counseling, spiritual, religious counseling, or public counseling, does it make any difference? And to the individual themselves, and also to the community. So you have to discuss this in detail as much as possible. And then of course you have to look at the gap. What gaps are there? How can you bridge this gap when it comes to the medical philosophy, when it comes to the aspects of the human being? Because every human being is having a need. Every human being is having a basic need. Now, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of the basic needs, there's always the top or the top level of the pyramid, which actually talk about actualization. Now, if the person or a human being comes to you for counseling, or spiritual counseling, or religious counseling, how can you use, for an example, Maslow's hierarchy as an example or as a basis to make sure that you will address the need of a person? What if the person is having a medical need? How are you going to address this medical need? And remember, this is specifically for people living with HIV, or people that are actually in a situation where they are being affected or infected. How are you going to use religious, spiritual, and biblical principles in your counseling session for this person? So it's very important that when you are going to give this assignment, or you're going to prepare for this assignment, you have to make sure that you also make it very much practical, and then also give some practical assignment. So I hope that this presentation helps you, and it gives you as a guide, and I wish you all the best with your assignment, and I thank you.